Megan, Sarah, hello. How are you both doing?
Well, how are you?
I'm good, thank
Hi.
you. I'm very, very good. We're starting our videos by asking our contributors to introduce themselves and to give us an overview of their work. So may I hand over to the two of you to do that, please?
All right, I can start. So I'm Sarah. I always stumble a little bit because I have my academic interests have had this sort of like long trajectory. And I'm never sure what am I doing now. I started off doing theater and Shakespeare and feminist performance stuff in the 20th century, and somehow that led me into book history. And specifically the bibliography, the materiality of like how books are made. And what I'm really interested in is how the physical presence of a text in your hand shapes how we use it and how it passes through history. And so thinking of those objects as stretching across time. I used to work in a library, and now I work by myself doing some sort of public outreach around libraries and books, I guess, is sort of what I'm interested in, but also everything. That's what I do.
Great, thank you. Megan?
Great. So my interests overlap with Sarah's when it comes to early modern printed books, but I kind of come at it from the other historical side of things. So I'm a medievalist by training. I got really interested in early printed editions of Chaucer and wound up writing my dissertation and my first book on those, and thinking about sort of the whole host of both literary but also historical and antiquarian and lexicographical forces that go into shaping these enormous folio editions of Chaucer that are published between 1532 and 1602. They're the largest printed collections of poetry printed in England during the 16th century. And that led me to an interest in textual scholarship, which is what I've been working on more intensively in the last couple of months. So with Lisa Strahov, who's at Marquette, we did an edition of John Lydgate's Dance of Death poems, and some related works. That was super fun. That was for Teens Medieval series, the Middle English text series. And early modernists might know these because they were painted, both the verses and we think illustrations were painted on the interior wall of the Pardon Churchyard at St. Paul's in the 15th century. And then in the early part of the 16th century, Thomas Wolsey had the Pardon Churchyard pulled down. There was a shrine to Becket in the middle that seems to have either been the reason they pulled it down or served as like a convenient reason for doing so. And a bunch of those stones are now in the foundations of Somerset House on the Strand in London. So it's with us still.
Wow. Okay. So in this conversation, we're dealing with book history with one of you coming at early modern book history from the contemporary and the now, and the other of you coming from the medieval period and thinking about when texts produced pre-print, before print was a thing, at least in England, when those texts meet the world of print. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think both my work and Sarah's work are kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong or you want to add to this, Sarah, interested in what it means to translate a text from one medium to another, right? Whether that's from manuscript to print or from print to performance. And coming at this from a kind of textual studies perspective, you're trained to sort of think about, you know, dialect and scribal hands and, you know, this compositor or that compositor. And there's just so much more to it than that, sort of extra literary concerns that go into what I think about as the beginning of literary history. I don't know, do you want to add to that, Sarah?
No, I think I just compliment that the thing that I find interesting, I always joke when I used to teach, and sometimes when I give lectures, that like, I'm not really interested in the text. And I know I have an English PhD, but I've never really been interested in the text. I've always been interested in what we do with the text and what the text is allowed to do given the material circumstances. So for performance, that meant like I was really interested in the actor training and theater company finances and what that allowed. And with books, I'm less interested in the text than what people physically, like, how do they hold the book, and are they writing in the book, and are they using that book to make other books, and all those sorts of things. I guess maybe I had a brief moment of being interested in text, but there's so much more that I do like to read, I should add that. But there is so much more to a book than the words that are either written or printed on the page. And I think that's the thing that that's a big point of alignment that Megan and I have in our approaches to thinking about all of this, that I think literature scholars who are not oriented towards book history spend less time thinking about.
Yeah, and these
Yeah.
videos we're hoping are aimed at as wide a viewership as possible. So I wonder if I can get the two of you just to be in dialogue with that idea of there being things in books beyond the words, and there being uses for books beyond the words. Yeah, how does that work in the crossovers between the things that you two do?
Well, so Sarah has recently written a book about studying early printed books, which I've been working through with my students this past week. If we want to talk at all about converting the history of the book class to remote learning, I certainly have a lot of thoughts about that at this particular moment.
Yeah.
But one thing that I really like about your book, Sarah, is how you talk about users of books rather than just readers. And that becomes, I think, super important when we're talking about kind of hyper-canonical figures like Chaucer, like Shakespeare. And once you start to kind of scratch the surface about what's in these books and where they go and who seems to own them, it becomes clear that people care about this stuff for a whole host of reasons that goes way beyond the kind of traditional purview of literary studies, right? So that you find, people, one of my favorite examples of this for the early modernists is that John Fox has a lot to say about what he thinks about Chaucer. And so we've got our 16th century radical Protestant who does not particularly care about, the frame narrative of the Canterbury Tales or, the development of rhyme royal. But you think about how many people encountered acts and monuments. And it becomes clear that...
Which is John Fox's book, I should just clarify.
Yes. Sorry, thank you. So books can do all sorts of things that don't necessarily line up with what we think of as literary reading. But they're still part of this circuit between kind of responding to the text and determining what the physical book is going to look like, right? So the discipline of book history gives us all these tools for thinking about how form affects meaning, right? That's D.F. Mackenzie, the 20th century bibliographer, his famous phrase. So we have this whole set of tools for thinking about that. And then you sort of take the guardrails off, right? And say, okay, I'm no longer just interested in what somebody like Spenser or Shakespeare thought about Chaucer, but also what did John Fox think about Chaucer? What did other chroniclers, what did early dictionary makers do with Chaucer? And it's clear that there's this whole world of engagement and response and meaning making. And this sort of gets at the question of like, what is literature? That goes way beyond what we ordinarily think of as literary reading.
The thing I really like about book use, like talking about users of books instead of readers of books, which is I should just clarify too and credit that like thinking about book use really comes from Bill Sherman, who wrote a book called Used Books, and Bill gets it from Carla Mazzio and Braden McCormack had this amazing exhibit and then this catalog that's fabulous if you can ever get your hands on it, called Book Use, Book Theory. I don't know, it's about early modern books. And they sort of talk about like why they're interested in book use, because you don't just read one thing, you don't just read a book. Like one of the uses that Chaucer gets put to, I'm sure, is people buy these books firsthand or secondhand or inherit these books, not to read them, but to have them. Right? Like we do this today. I don't even want to talk about the number of books that I buy, either just because it's gorgeous and I want to own it, or I'm like, oh, aspirational, someday I will read these books. But even when you think about like reading, the different types of reading that people do, so when I was teaching, one of the favorite things I would do with undergraduates is talk about, well, like, let's talk about reading. Like, what does it mean to read a book? If I can read Hebrew. I mean, like, I know the letters, and it needs to have the vowels for me because I'm not fluent. And not only am I not fluent, if it's not a prayer book, I honestly have no idea what I'm saying, but I can read it, right? Like if somebody else is reading it aloud, I'd be like, this is the moment in the text that I'm at. Is that reading? Is that not reading? Skimming reading or not reading? So there's just so many, and some books are designed to be skimmed. Some books are designed to be read from beginning to end, which Peter Stollybrass, a former teacher of both Megan's and mine at different periods, likes to talk about how ridiculous it is that novels, like the most books that have been published that tend to be encountered and that were really influential in getting it to spread were novels. Novels are based on the Codex form. But the thing that's amazing about a Codex as opposed to a scroll is that you can read it discontinuously, right? You can jump from page 13 to page 500, whereas a scroll, you have to scroll along. And how ridiculous is it that the physical form that is meant to encourage discontinuous reading has had its most prominent exemplar in a textual form that demands to be read from beginning to end.
Yeah. Sarah, can I just jump in and ask you to clarify what you mean by the Codex form?
Oh, yeah. So Codex is just a stupid fancy way of saying book, but it's more specific. So a book can mean lots of things. Like if I say to you, hey, Andy, have you read a good book recently? And you might say, no, I haven't had time. Or yeah, like I read Anna Karenina for the 50th time and it was amazing. And you don't mean that a specific object. Like I read this copy of Anna Karenina and it was way better than your copy of Anna Karenina. You just mean I read a text. So book encompasses a ton of meanings in it, but a codex is what's the technical, I'm going to get it back right. A codex is basically a gathering of separate leaves of a material. It could be paper, it could be parchment, it could be whatever, that are bound on one side. So it refers to a really specific, and codices don't have to be printed. We think of books as being printed, but books can be manuscript, or books can be print and manuscript, or books could just be pictures. So it just refers to like the physical form of it.
And the key thing from what you were saying before I really interrupted is that whereas a scroll takes you from A to B in terms of what it encourages your eyes and your hands to do, the Codex enables you to cross-refer between what would otherwise be kind of a linear space of the whole thing. I'm not putting that very well, but it enables you to move and to shift and hyperlink, to put it in modern language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's a super interesting, this is a little bit off track, but it's super interesting. Peter Scolly-Brass is the one who sort of popularized the idea in print, although it doesn't really originate with him. The Codex form is strongly, for us today, we see it backwards. When you say scroll, and I would ask people like, how many people encounter scrolls in their daily lives or in their regular lives? And basically the only ones of us who say, oh yeah, we deal with scrolls all the time are Jews who go to services, because every week we read from the Torah and it's a big scroll. But a way to flip that on its head is to think that the origins of the Codex happen at a moment when Christianity is really developing and spreading. And it becomes a form that distinguishes Christian texts from Jewish texts. And that one of the reasons that happens is that it's part of a way of reading the New Testament that makes you refer back to the Old Testament, so that you're cross reading. So then if you're doing that, you can't have a scroll because you need to flip back and forth. So it's really interesting. It's another way of that sort of all the material form stuff that Meg and I have been talking about how connected it is with what a culture needs, and how a culture responds to things. It's all part and parcel of the same stuff, even aside from the words that are in it.
So taking up that idea then of what a culture needs, and going back to John Fox reading Geoffrey Chaucer, what did Fox and his culture need from Chaucer?
Oh, okay. I have a lot of answers. This is this tale that keeps wafting through the frame is Sam the cat, by the way.
There he is. Oh, he's come to say hi.
Oh, hello.
Okay. He likes to think he's a star. He is a star. Right, so this gets back to what I was saying a minute ago about the kinds of work that literary text or literary figures like Chaucer can do that extend far beyond what we think of as just being a model for future imaginative writing, right? So John Fox is writing Acts and Monuments at the beginning of the second half of the 16th century, and it's something that he'll come back to and revise at several different points throughout his life. So what he has to say about Chaucer does shift a little bit. But in general, he is building off of at least 50 and maybe as much as 70 or 80 years of claims that Chaucer had been a proto-Protestant, right? So Chaucer dies in 1400, which means that he's around while John Wycliffe and his followers, who are sometimes called the Lollards, are both gaining a certain number of adherents and also really starting to face crackdowns. And this will culminate in things like the constitutions of Arundel. Archbishop Thomas Arundel issues this decree in 1412 that really effectively limits the production of vernacular spiritual writing. Nicholas Watson and other scholars have written about that and its ramifications at some length. Chaucer himself is not an especially religious writer. He has his Legends of St. Cecilia. He's got the Parson's Tale at the end of the Canterbury Tales. He says in the Retraction, right, that he has translated a life of Mary Magdalene, although that doesn't survive. But Chaucer is so hard to pin down, right? Because he was living in this time of great political and religious upheaval, and he managed to kind of thread the needle, it seems like. So that kind of flexibility and also the formal qualities of the Canterbury Tales, I'll come to that in a minute, make it possible to sort of imagine Chaucer being whatever you need him to be. So in the case of Chaucer and John Fox, the Canterbury Tales is is incomplete, right? It seems like Chaucer worked on it up to or close to his death. The pattern of storytelling that's laid out in the general prologue is absolutely not carried through, right? No, most pilgrims don't have stories at all. Nobody gets two except for Chaucer himself, and that's only because he's interrupted. So some of you may remember, right, Chaucer has these three ideal pilgrims. There's the knight, there's the parson, and then there's the parson's brother, the plowman. And as far as we know, Chaucer never wrote a tale for the plowman. But by the end of the 15th century or the early 16th century, there are texts that people start to identify as being the plowman's tale. And this is part of a whole host of additions and alterations and interpolations to the Canterbury Tales that takes place in the 15th century. So that in and of itself, that kind of working with the flexibility of the tale structure is not new. What is new is that the text that is most commonly ascribed to the plowman is an anti-fraternal satire, right? So it's this invective against the friars and the perceived excesses of the church. And there's a lot of uncertainty about when and where and how this poem gets attached to the Canterbury Tales. But it's not in any of the early printed editions of the Canterbury Tales. It's not in the very first collected edition of Chaucer's works, but it is in the next one after that, which is printed in 1542. And this seems to have created a widespread assumption that Chaucer was a proto-Protestant, right? This is not a text that's by Chaucer, but for example, Spencer cites it in the Shepherd's Calendar. People seem to have just assumed that this is how it was. So for most 16th century readers, Chaucer would have been this proto-Protestant figure. And that's exactly why he's valuable to Fox, because it's a way of saying the best. So there's this long tradition of concatenating Chaucer, the English language, and Englishness. And it's easy to you don't have to think about that too long to understand how it's both slippery and also potentially problematic. But it's precisely because of that connection that Chaucer is such an interesting figure for Fox, right? That here's someone who is regarded in a wide variety of contexts as exemplifying something about what English and England can do. And Fox is going to go and say, and boom, he is a proto-Protestant. He actually cites a couple of other apocryphal texts in justifying this claim about Chaucer. He doesn't talk too much about the Plowman's Tale, although that's clearly what the basis of it is. But Fox is such a nice example because it shows how questions of canon and how questions of what was getting printed in these large collected editions shape the conversation about the English past in a way that goes far beyond poetry and gets at other kind of issues. That was a long answer, but that was the chapter in the book when I drafted it. It was like 80 pages, and it was like, no. There you go.
I also have Megan's book sitting on my shelf. Wait, can I ask I don't know if this is too big of a question to answer, but what's the impact of that Chaucer's circulating in the 16th, I'm getting my dates right, in the 16th century, in the 1500s, primarily in like these big collected works, as opposed to like, oh, here's Legends of Good Women, or like, oh, here's Canterbury Tales. I mean, I know that Canterbury's on its own has been printed, but am I correct that my impression is he turns into this big monolith? And then my real question is like, what's up with that?
So I wrote a whole book about those big fat books, and I'm still not entirely sure I have a concise answer. But I do think it gets at the slipperiness of books for using versus books for reading, right? So it's clear there's things you can do with a small edition of the Canterbury Tales, right? You can put it in your pocket, well, I guess your bag. You can carry it around, you can read it privately. These big folio editions, they look like law books, they look like religious books, and I think that they must have lived similar lives, right? Kind of mostly on the shelf. Certainly we have examples of copies that were really intensively read and annotated, so people did that.
Right.
And there's antecedents for these big collections. The Ellesmere Chaucer that's at the Huntington Library, which is just beautiful and extravagantly illustrated, is a big fat book. One of my favorite Chaucer manuscripts, Cambridge University Library GG427, also seems to be a attempt to kind of bring together Chaucer's greatest hits. So there's something going on with wanting an opera, right? A collected works. There's something going on about saying this is a monument to English literary history. And I think for some book buyers and for some of the people who were involved in making those books, like, that's enough, right? It's just enough to know that we have an English Homer, right? Or the title of one of the later editions is Our Most Ancient and Learned English Poet, Geoffrey Chaucer, right? And so that gets back to the question of like what a book can do, even if it's not being read. Certainly people did read it intensively, but kind of one-off individual reading does not seem to have been a priority.
I'm just thinking, like, in contrast to how poetry in print, like sonnets, like all these little lyric poems, and Toddle's Miscellany, which is a super popular collection of songs and sonnets, poems, short lyric poems that Toddle gathered, and then is in a lot of cases the first printed example of some of the poems that then later become canonized and what we study today. How those sonnets are they're so intimate. I mean, not just the form, but I mean like the physical form in which they appear, and there's the sense of like you can curl up, you can read it. And then the circulation of, I am not a poetry person and I'm not a manuscript person, so this is where I get confused. But so my question is, a lot of Renaissance lyric poetry we find recirculated in bits in like people's commonplace books, or their own miscellanies that they're gathering, and people are copying in, like Tumblr, people are copying in their favorite little bits of poems. So does that happen with Chaucer?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm 90% sure that there's a Chaucer poem in Toddle's Miscellany. I have to check. But one of the short ones, obviously. You find Chaucer quoted in all kinds of places, including in commonplace books. You also find, and this is where medieval poetry goes on to lead a slightly different life than early modern lyric poetry, you'll also find it quoted in chronicle histories and things like that. Not necessarily Chaucer so specifically. Gower gets cited a lot because he's got some very, Gower is a near contemporary of Chaucer's, and he wrote a poem called the Vox Clamantis, which deals with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And there's a couple of other, again, kind of historically situated moments in his writings. So medieval...
Plus he's a character in Shakespeare, which Chaucer never is.
That too.
So one up for Gower, just as an aside.
Yeah, he gets to come from ancient ashes.
Yeah, exactly.
So just to go back to answer your question, yeah, Chaucer, certain phrases are very popular. By the time you get to the end of the 16th century, they're printing Chaucer with manicules, pointing fists, for particular proverbial phrases. So some, particularly Troilus and Cresside, Pandarus, the character of Pandarus, speaks in a lot of platitudes. And the thing about Proverbs is that they last forever. So there's phrases, dead as a doornail, I think, is in Troilus and Cresside somewhere.
Oh.
So people do pick up on these, they note them, they underline them. And presumably, although I've looked mostly at annotations in printed copies, they're noting them so that they can copy them out.
Right. Cool. Huh. I don't have to follow up.
Sarah.
That also raises the question of how well people in the 16th century could read Middle English, and whether Chaucer was something that you could sit down and just pick up and read through, or something that you would need help kind of parsing. And that's something that seems to change quite a lot over the historical period that I've looked at. So the first collected printed edition comes out in 1532. It's dedicated to Henry VIII. It's like, oh, you're the best king, so we're going to give you the works of the best poet. And there's absolutely no suggestion there that anyone involved should have any difficulty reading the writing. And then by the time you get to 1598 and 1602, these are printed with glossaries in the back, with hard words. And obviously you've had a lot going on in the development of hard word lists and terms of art and dictionaries in general between 1532 and 1598. But it does also seem to register something changing.
So that's awesome, in part because that brings something that I think we're both interested in but hasn't come up yet, which is the ways that we can use the what's in a book as a way of understanding developments in culture. So that, I mean, there are other signs of evidence that English changes over that century. And if you read it, I mean, like Skelton is just really different than Sydney later ones. The language is just, English is just really different. But also then being able to point to and being like, look, early ones, no glossary. Later ones, oh, glossary, what does that tell us about what has happened to English language and expectations of readership and knowledge, all sorts of stuff, which is the other thing that books can, when we think about what books have to offer aside from text. I mean, it is about text, which is why I hesitated, but also it's not really about the text. It's about what are the needs that created that text.
Right, and what are people expected to do with it, right? So in the book, I say that Chaucer goes from being something to read to being something to study. Right. Over this period of about 70 years. And that doesn't mean people don't read, but it's a different kind of reading.
One of the most, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna talk about teaching. So like one of the most fun things to do, which you can do in any library, you don't need to like be in a special collection. So I used to work at the Folger Shakespeare Library, which obviously had just so much Shakespeare. But you can do it in any library if you just look at editions of Shakespeare's plays. And if you start with, I mean, if you have the ability to look at the 16th century, 17th century ones, or even just in facsimiles, and then you can take that through up to the most recent Ardens, and the gradual shift towards there become line numbers, and then they become commentary. The commentary starts really early. And originally in the commentary, the focus on textual authority, like we've changed this word to sort of like having to explain different aspects of the culture, and then seeing what things get explained and what things don't get explained. I think it's super fun. Students seem to sort of also think it's really interesting because they're just used to, like, they get the Folger Shakespeare or whatever, the Cambridge School, I don't know what the standard one is in England. And they just sort of take it for granted that this is how you study Shakespeare, but to be able to point at books and be like, look, people, and then you can pull out other Shakespeare editions and be like, and not only do people study it, people turn it into graphic cartoons, and people, add video clips, and you can learn a lot from how people use Shakespeare as he should
Absolutely.
be.
Yeah.
And likewise, Chaucer.
Yeah, I was just going to say another thing I like to do is go back and look with students at the Chaucer manuscripts, many of which are digitized now, and many of which, in one way or another, bear evidence of a lively existence, quite apart from poetic readers. So one of my favorites, I mentioned the Ellesmere Chaucer a few minutes ago, is at several different points in the book, I think, someone has written in what we might describe as a juvenile hand, Marjorie St. John is a shrew.
That's awesome. Oh, that's so good. I didn't know that.
I just imagine someone, like not locked up, right? But with not much to do and this big book, who's just like really mad at Marjorie St. John for whatever she's done, and driving it there for posterity.
I love that. And the thing I love about that too is that sense of, like, these treasures that we now have in libraries, and the Ellesmere Chaucer is a treasure, right? Like, that's is one of the jewels of the Huntington. Like, these are just like incredibly amazing things, but they weren't always. Once upon a time, there were books that somebody scrawled juvenile stuff in, right? Like that shift. I'm always really interested in that shift when it happens, or sometimes even if it happens, from thing that's just an ordinary textual object to thing that is precious and you have to get special permission to look at it. I'm assuming that the Ellesmere, you probably need a reason to look at it, as opposed to many other rare books in rare libraries. You just fill out a call slip and you type into Aeon and it comes up. There are always some stuff that is so special that it's restricted. And you say, I have a legit reason why I have to look at this, as opposed to a facsimile. That shift is really interesting to me.
Yeah. And that's actually one of my favorite things about teaching history of the book as well, is you get to kind of push back against that shift, right? Yep. So where I teach in Maine, we've got a small but pretty interesting special collection. We've got a couple of really early books, stuff printed before 1500, and then, oh my God, so many 18th, 19th century theological books, right? Because we were founded by Baptists, and they're old, and some of them have like really compelling. A lot of them are in older bindings, right, which are really compelling. And so the process of getting to take students over the course of weeks or months into special collections for repeated visits, where it starts out, you've almost got the sense of like, I'm taking you into the Holy of Holies. Our special collections room in the library is not known by this anymore, but it used to be called the treasure room. Yeah. And I should say here that so I teach at a place called Colby College, and we have amazing special collections staff, particularly Pat Burdick and Aaron Rhodes, who are the librarians I work with most closely there. And to be able to bring students into special collections and have them become like readers and users of these books, right? Instead of just witnesses to what other people have done, and they become a part of the book's story in much the same way that whoever wrote that nasty thing about Marjorie St. John also becomes a part of the book's story. And yeah, it's cool that it can work both ways.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know, I've been working with rare books for Well, I did not when I started off because I was doing that whole performance thing. But I've been working really intensively with rare books at a really impressive collection for, like well over a decade now. And I still have these moments of like, wow, I'm touching this old book. Like they just let me look at this. And I have found my favorite thing about teaching students when it's their first time in libraries is that it's so easy when you're like, oh, well, I have to read this thing and the only copy is here. I'm just going to go and read it. Like we can get jaded very easily doing the sort of research that we are expected to do, right? It's really easy to be like, oh, if I go to the British Library again, I wonder if coffee will be decent, or, But with people who it's their first time, it suddenly reminds us of like, these things are kind of magical. Like it really is, in a way that's not just about treasures, but about their existence into our life and bringing the past into the present, and then you becoming part of that story. I had a student who from Georgetown, I now can't remember what his name is, but Georgetown had done like a little promo film about their students in my class at the Folger, and so there's this beautiful moment where they're interviewing him. And he talks about one of the things that he loves about being a student coming to the Folger is that he leaves at the end of the day with the 17th century on his fingertips.
Oh, my heart.
Right? I love, like, I have a little video clip. I watch it periodically where I feel like, oh, my life this is pointless, this work. And then I see him say this and I'm like, oh, I never thought of it that way. Like that intimacy that you get from handling any of these objects and letting them be part of your life and being part of their lives is just such a joy.
Yeah.
We should move towards wrapping up, I think, in a moment. Megan, did you want to add something before I move to
I just wanted to say real quickly, like as a researcher, I also learn from my students, right? Because in order to do kind of like large scale research like you do to write a book or edit a text, you do get jaded because you have to be, because you need a routine, you need structure, or it's chaos. And then students say, oh, why is this like that? Or, what is this thing going on that I'd never noticed in a book that I taught with, a dozen times before. That's also very cool. So.
Yeah, it is. It's super cool.
It's been a super cool conversation. I'm going to wrap up just a little bit, just partly for the listeners' benefit and partly so you guys can correct me if I've got anything wrong. But Megan said towards the start of our conversation, registered hypercanonical authors as a kind of research interest. And I guess one of the things we've done in this conversation is trace the weirdness of the canonization process in a writer we might otherwise take for granted, like Geoffrey Chaucer. I love the fact he's being described to Henry VIII as the most ancient English writer. And I wonder what on earth that does to, older English writers and the notion of Englishness itself. It's kind of writing pre-1480s out of existence in really fascinating ways and saying something about English as a language, as a kind of nationality. We filmed a video recently with Eleanor Yarniger. It's up on our website already, discussing the 14th century and how oddly like the 16th century, the 14th century was. And I can see why someone like Chaucer is really speaking to people living through, yet again, religious reformation, periods of plague, and periods of quite serious political and religious restructure. Yeah. I love the idea of Chaucer existing as a big book, especially next to books like Songs and Sonnets, the Tottle volume that you mentioned, where sonnet, literally means a tiny song, a little song. And then you've got kabam, this massive Chaucer who's being physicalized as something which is big. And then the final thing I'll say in wrapping up our conversation, and Megan, it's partly a tribute to your cat, is I wonder if the cat in the shot of this is the new genre of our time, is that the equivalent to the sexual shaming you're describing in the Chaucer, where one of the glories of that is this supposedly kind of fixed professional space that we're creating here. We often think of a book or a manuscript like that, and then to discover some random person shaming some other random person is this sudden glimpse of real life in the middle of a space we thought we understood the perimeters of. That's a lot to throw at you, but yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I was thinking before we started this conversation, I was thinking about this world of this novel coronavirus and wondering to myself sort of like what what will be the artifacts of this moment that historians looking back on will be like, oh yeah, you can see this. And I guess I was thinking partly about textual artifacts, which is hard to imagine, but I do think this huge shift to seeing the insides of people's homes and seeing their personal lives suddenly being in front of joined with their professional lives. So like there's Sam and they're the news anchors broadcasting from their basements. I think that's going to be one of the things that registers this moment as a shift that wouldn't have happened before. And I like the idea of thinking about it as those sort of like marginal moments in books where suddenly something non-textual and this little glimpse of a past life pops up in a written record.
Yeah, what you were saying, Andy, brings to mind the marginal figures in medieval manuscripts, right? These like carnivalesque, you know, jousting snails, right? Like guys blowing trumpets out of their butts, the whole, you know, menagerie. And, you know, those figures, it's not my field, first of all, and they can be enigmatic to interpret. But the people who made those manuscripts put them there for a reason. And presumably that reason had something to do with the fact of the sum, you know, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, right? That there's something about that juxtaposition, whether it's an artifact of the history of a book and its uses in the case of marginalia, or the kind of jarring experience I've had of going back and reading the Canterbury Tales in these early editions and finding that they include some material that was never in by Riverside Chaucer that I studied from while I was in school, that it's at these moments of sort of suture and unexpected juxtaposition that we, you know, we gravitate towards them because we can make meaning from them. And whether it's I don't know if it's clear, this is Sam. When Sarah said Sam, she's referring to this creature back here. We like that. We need that. There's something very human in that.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, both of you. We're ending our conversations by asking contributors what the word literature means to them, whether it's a helpful word, an unhelpful word, whether it features in their lexicon, either professionally or personally. I'm going to ask you to speak quite briefly for this question, if that's all right. But yeah, does the word have value or meaning to you?
I'm going to answer the question by not answering it. So I'm teaching right now a course that is our intro to the major for students, and it's called Foundations of Literary Studies. And we start the class, I give them a whole bunch of different things, and we say, is it literature? And you can talk with a room full of college students about what is literature all day. But the thing that I try to emphasize that and this is something that's very important to me as a literary historian, is that literature should encompass the interesting rather than just the good. So I'm interested in literature as a category that you know, denotes the imaginative, the formally specific, but that I'm interested in ways that go beyond just, is this compelling storytelling?
Right.
That's just to me. Other people might differ, but
great. Thank you.
Sarah?
So it's funny because my doctoral degree is from a department of English literature. That's what it is. But when I was in that program, I wasn't interested in literature. I was interested in theater finances. And then I moved into the library world. And I'm not in the sort of book history that I'm in. The objects that I'm interested in study are usually not objects that are literature, because those tend to be collected in ways that make them, you know, pristine and boring to me. Other people have interests that draw them to it, and that's not my thing. So when I think of the word literature, I tend to think of not as like, what did I train in, or what do I teach students in? Because I don't teach students literature. I haven't done that in ages. I tend to think about what books do I read. In literary, like literature in terms of pleasure reading is super fraught because there's a difference between literature and genre. I read genre, I read murder mysteries. And so I guess what I think when you ask me, like, do I find literature useful? I find it useful as a political term and what gets included and what gets excluded from it. And so I guess I would think that sort of like, it's a term that has value in letting us trace what we study, but we should always be aware too of what has been excluded over the centuries and over now is somehow not being literature. And isn't that it goes back to borders? Isn't that border between what's literature and what's not literature that I think is sort of fun.
Great. It's been really fabulous talking to two people who've written such excellent books about books, books, as I like to think of them. A big thank you to you both.
Thank you. This has been super. This has been really fun.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.